It was one of those quiet Tuesday evenings when the sun was just starting to set behind the tall oak trees that lined Riverside Drive. Officer Derek Matthews had been patrolling this wealthy neighborhood for about 3 hours now, driving slowly, through streets where every house seemed to cost more than most people made in 10 years. The perfectly manicured lawns, expensive cars and driveways, and security cameras on every corner told him everything he needed to know about who belonged here and who didn't. Derek had grown up on the other side of town, in a neighborhood where broken streetlights stayed broken for months and corner stores had bulletproof glass. He'd worked hard to become a police officer, telling himself he was protecting the good people from the bad ones. But somewhere along the way, his definition of good and bad had gotten twisted up with the color of people's skin and the size of their bank accounts. As he turned onto Winchester Avenue, his radio crackled with the usual evening chatter from dispatch. Nothing exciting was happening tonight, which was both good and bad. Good because it meant the neighborhood was safe. Bad because Derek was the kind of officer who liked action, who believed that real police work meant finding trouble before it found you. That's when he saw the car. It was an older Honda Civic, maybe 10 years old, with a small dent in the rear bumper and paint that had seen better days. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. The kind of car that belonged in Derek's old neighborhood, not here among the BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes. But it wasn't just the car that caught his attention. It was the driver. Through the rear window, Derek could see an elderly black man behind the wheel. The man was driving carefully, following all the traffic rules, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, wasn't doing anything wrong. But in Derek's mind, that didn't matter. What mattered was that this man didn't fit the picture of who should be driving through Riverside at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Derek's pulse quickened the way it always did when his instincts told him something was off. He'd learned to trust those instincts over his 5 years on the force, even though they seemed to kick in more often when the person he was looking at had dark skin. He told himself it wasn't about race, it was about experience. It was about knowing when something didn't add up. The Honda stopped at a red light, and Derek pulled up behind it, studying the license plate. He ran it through the system quickly, but it came back clean. No warrants, no violations, nothing suspicious. The car was registered to someone named Harold Washington at an address across town in a much more modest neighborhood. That was all Derek needed to know. He flipped on his emergency lights. The Honda's driver saw the flashing blues and reds in his rearview mirror and did exactly what any law-abiding citizen would do. He put on his turn signal, pulled over to the curb, and turned off his engine. He placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be easily seen and waited patiently. This was Judge Harold Washington, though Derek had no way of knowing that. For the past 30 years, Harold had served on various courts, working his way up through the legal system with dignity and fairness. 2 years ago, he'd been appointed to the highest court in the land, a position he'd earned through decades of brilliant legal work and an unwavering commitment to justice. But right now, sitting in his modest car on this quiet street, he was just another elderly black man who'd learned long ago how to survive encounters with suspicious police officers. He'd been through this before many times back in the days when such stops were even more common and far more dangerous. He knew the routine. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, don't make any sudden movements, and hope the officer was having a good day. Derek stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward the Honda with the swagger he'd developed over the years. It was a walk that said he was in charge, that he had the power here, that whoever was in that car better show him the proper respect. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his service weapon, not because he expected trouble, but because it was a gesture that usually made people nervous enough to tell him what he wanted to hear. As he approached the driver's side window, Derek could see the man more clearly. He was probably in his late 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a simple cardigan sweater over a white shirt, the kind of outfit a grandfather might wear to dinner with his family. But Derek didn't see a grandfather. He saw a black man in a car that didn't belong in this neighborhood, and that was enough. The window was already rolled down by the time Derek reached it. The elderly man looked up at him with a calm expression, though Derek could see the slight tension around his eyes. It was the look of someone who'd been through this before and knew it probably wouldn't be pleasant. "Good evening, officer," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the refined tone of someone who'd spent years speaking in courtrooms. Is there a problem? Derek didn't return the greeting. Instead, he leaned down slightly, using his height and position to intimidate. License and registration, he said curtly, his voice carrying that official tone that brooked no argument. Harold reached slowly into his jacket pocket, being careful to move deliberately so the officer wouldn't misinterpret his actions. He pulled out his wallet and extracted his driver's license, then reached into his glove compartment for the registration papers. Everything was in order, everything was legal, everything was exactly as it should be. But Derek wasn't really interested in the paperwork. He was interested in making a point, in showing this man that he was being watched, that he didn't belong here, that Derek was the one with the power to decide who could drive through these streets and who couldn't. As Harold handed over his documents, their eyes met for just a moment. In that brief exchange, two very different worldviews collided. Harold saw a young officer who'd probably started his career with good intentions, but had lost his way somewhere along the path. Derek saw exactly what his prejudices had trained him to see, a potential threat that needed to be controlled. Neither man knew that in the next few minutes both of their lives were about to change forever. Derek took the license and registration from Harold's steady hands, making sure to hold on to them longer than necessary. It was a small power play, but one that usually got the message across. He studied the documents under his flashlight, even though the street lamps provided plenty of light to read by. Harold Washington, Derek read aloud, his voice carrying a tone that made the name sound suspicious somehow. Address shows you live over on Martin Luther King Boulevard. That's quite a ways from here, isn't it? Harold nodded politely. Yes, sir. About 20 minutes in light traffic. So what brings you to this neighborhood? Derek asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the license photo back to Harold's face. You visiting someone? Looking for work? What's your business here? The questions came out sharp and accusatory, as if being in Riverside was somehow a crime that needed explaining. Harold had heard this tone before, many times over the years. It was the sound of suspicion wrapped up in official authority, the voice of someone who'd already decided you were guilty of something, even if they weren't sure what yet. I was having dinner with my family, Harold replied calmly. My daughter lives just a few blocks from here on Oakwood Street. Derek's eyebrows shot up. Your daughter lives in this neighborhood? He said it like it was the most unbelievable thing he'd ever heard. What does she do for work? She's a lawyer, Harold answered, his voice still patient despite the officer's obvious disbelief. A lawyer, Derek repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words and finding them bitter. What kind of lawyer? She specializes in civil rights, law. Now Derek actually laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed in the quiet evening air. Civil rights, huh? Let me guess, she's one of those lawyers who spends all day trying to sue police officers? Harold felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he kept his voice steady. She believes in justice for everyone, officer. Just like the law requires. The law, Derek said, stepping closer to the car window. You know what the law says about suspicious activity? It says I have every right to investigate when something doesn't add up. And an old man like you driving through here at night, claiming his daughter is some hotshot lawyer? That doesn't add up to me. Harold could feel the situation shifting, getting more dangerous. He'd seen this escalation pattern before, back in his younger days when such encounters were even more common. The officer was working himself up, building a case in his mind for why this stop was justified, why Harold deserved whatever was coming next. Officer, Harold said carefully, I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't broken any laws. I was driving the speed limit, I stopped at all the lights, and I've been completely cooperative. Derek walked around to the back of the Honda, shining his flashlight through the rear window, even though there was nothing to see except some grocery bags and a jacket on the back seat. He was buying time, trying to think of a reason to keep this going, to prove his instincts were right about this man. Step out of the vehicle, Derek commanded suddenly. Harold's heart rate picked up, but he kept his voice calm. May I ask why? I don't need to explain myself to you, Derek snapped. I'm conducting an investigation. Step out of the car now. Slowly, Harold opened his door and stood up. At 68, he wasn't as spry as he used to be, and the movement took him a moment. Derek immediately misinterpreted this as hesitation, as potential resistance. Move faster, Derek ordered. Put your hands where I can see them. Harold raised, his hands slightly, a gesture he'd hoped never to have to make again at this stage of his life. He stood beside his car, his cardigan sweater making him look more like someone's grandfather than any kind of threat. But Derek wasn't seeing a grandfather. He was seeing what his prejudices had trained him to see. Turn around, face the car, Derek instructed. I'm going to search you for weapons. Officer, is that really necessary? Harold asked. I'm clearly not armed. I'm an elderly man who was just having dinner with his family. I'll decide what's necessary, Derek shot back. You could be carrying drugs, weapons, anything. Turn around. Harold complied, placing his hands on the roof of his car while Derek performed a quick pat-down. It was humiliating being treated like a criminal on a public street where anyone could see. But Harold endured it with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout his life. What's this? Derek asked, pulling Harold's wallet from his back pocket. That's my wallet, officer. You already have my license. Derek flipped through it anyway, looking at credit cards, a few family photos, some business cards. Everything looked normal, legitimate, exactly what you'd expect to find in any respectable person's wallet. But Derek wasn't ready to admit he'd made a mistake. This address on your license, Derek said, waving the document in the air. I know that neighborhood. Lot of crime over there. Drug dealers, gang activity. You sure you're not involved in any of that? Harold turned around slowly, his patience finally starting to wear thin. Officer, I've been nothing but respectful to you. I've answered all your questions honestly. I've allowed you to search me, even though you have no legal reason to do so. But I will not stand here and let you accuse me of being a criminal simply because of where I live or what I look like. Derek's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. Watch your tone, he warned. I'm the one asking questions here, not you. By now, people in the nearby houses had started to notice what was happening. Porch lights were coming on, and faces appeared at windows. Some residents had their phones out recording the interaction. The sight of an elderly black man being harassed by a white police officer was exactly the kind of thing that went viral these days, and Derek should have realized he was being watched, but he was too caught up in his own authority, too convinced that he was right to notice the growing audience. All he could focus on was this man who dared to question him, who refused to be properly intimidated, who somehow maintained his dignity even while being treated like a suspect. I'm going to search your vehicle now, Derek announced. And if I find anything illegal, anything at all, you're going to jail tonight. Harold watched as the officer began going through his car, tossing items around carelessly, clearly hoping to find something, anything, that would justify this entire encounter. But there was nothing to find except the ordinary possessions of an ordinary man who'd done nothing wrong except drive through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time while having the wrong color skin. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and both men knew this situation was far from over. Derek was halfway through searching Harold's glove compartment when he heard the sound of heels clicking rapidly on the sidewalk. He looked up to see a well-dressed woman in her 30s hurrying toward them, her face a mixture of concern and barely controlled anger. She was clearly successful, wearing an expensive business suit and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what her rights were. Dad? What's going on here? She called out as she approached, her voice carrying across the quiet street. Derek straightened up, confused. This woman looked nothing like what he'd expected. She was professional, articulate, and obviously educated. Her car, a sleek black Lexus, was parked at the curb with the engine still running, as if she'd rushed over the moment she'd seen what was happening. Ma'am, please step back, Derek said, trying to regain control of the situation. This is official, police business. Official business? The woman's voice rose slightly. What exactly has my father done wrong? I've been watching from my house and I haven't seen him break a single law. Harold felt a mix of relief and worry as his daughter approached. He was glad she was there, But he also knew that her presence might make Derek even more defensive, more likely to escalate things just to prove he was in charge. Your father? Derek looked back and forth between them, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The family resemblance was clear once you looked for it, but Derek had been so caught up in his assumptions that he hadn't been looking for it. Yes, my father, she replied firmly. Harold Washington, and you are? Officer Derek Matthews, he replied automatically, though he was beginning to realize he might have made a serious mistake. Look, I pulled your father in over because he was driving suspiciously through this neighborhood. Suspiciously? The woman's eyebrows shot up. How exactly does one drive suspiciously while following all traffic laws? Derek felt his face getting hot. More neighbors had come out now, standing on their porches and in their driveways watching the scene unfold. Some were holding phones, clearly recording everything. This was not how he'd imagined his evening going. Ma'am, I don't have to explain my procedures to you, Derek said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. I had reasonable suspicion to make this stop. Reasonable suspicion of what? She pressed. My father was driving home from having dinner at my house. He does this every Tuesday. My neighbors know him. The security cameras on this street have footage of him coming and going dozens of times. So what exactly was suspicious about an elderly man driving carefully through a neighborhood where his daughter lives? Derek opened his mouth to respond, but no good answer came out. Everything she was saying made perfect sense, and he was starting to realize how this whole situation must look to the people watching. An old man, clearly no threat to anyone, being harassed by a police officer for no apparent reason. I was just doing my job, Derek stammered. Your job? The woman pulled out her phone and held it up, clearly recording now. Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate elderly citizens who haven't committed any crimes. Harold, who had been standing quietly beside his car throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. Officer Matthews, he said, his voice still calm despite everything that had happened. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Derek turned back to Harold, grateful for what seemed like a reasonable tone. Maybe the old man would help him save face, would accept some kind of explanation that would let Derek back out of this situation gracefully. I understand that you were trying to do your job, Harold continued, but I need you to understand something about who you've been treating as a criminal tonight. There was something in Harold's voice now, a weight and authority that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had been there all along and Derek had just been too blinded by his prejudices to hear it. I am Justice Harold Washington, Harold said clearly, his words carrying across the quiet street. I serve on the United States Supreme Court. For a moment, the entire street fell silent. Derek's mouth fell open and he stared at Harold as if he'd just claimed to be the president himself. The woman nodded grimly, pulling up something on her phone. That's right, she said, turning her phone screen toward Derek. Google him, Justice Harold Washington, appointed to the Supreme Court 2 years ago after 30 years of distinguished service in the federal court system. Derek's hands were shaking as he looked at the phone screen. There was Harold's official Supreme Court photo, showing him in his judicial robes with the same kind, intelligent eyes that had been looking at Derek with such patience all evening. The same man Derek had just spent 20 minutes treating like a common criminal. This can't be right, Derek whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. Everything suddenly made sense. The calm dignity, the educated speech, the expensive neighborhood where his daughter lived, the way Harold had endured the harassment without losing his composure. Oh, it's right, Harold's daughter said, her voice hard with anger. You just spent the last 20 minutes illegally detaining, searching, and humiliating one of the 9 most powerful judges in America, a man who has dedicated his entire life to upholding the law that you just spent 20 minutes breaking. Derek felt like the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. He looked around at all the neighbors watching, at all the phones recording, at the man he'd just treated with such disrespect. His career flashed before his eyes, and he realized that in the span of 20 minutes, he had probably destroyed everything he'd worked for. Justice Washington, Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. Harold looked at him with those same calm, patient eyes. Officer Matthews, he said quietly, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that it shouldn't matter who I am. Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their position or their color, or where they live. Derek wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he'd just been doing his job. But standing there under the streetlights, surrounded by witnesses, facing a Supreme Court justice he'd just humiliated, he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done, and he knew that by tomorrow morning everyone in America would know it too. By the time Derek got back to the police station that night, the videos were already spreading across social media like wildfire. Someone had posted the footage on Twitter with the caption, "Police officer harasses Supreme Court justice. Doesn't even know who he is." Within an hour it had been shared thousands of times. By midnight, news outlets were picking up the story. Derek sat in his patrol car in the station parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His phone kept buzzing with notifications, text messages, from friends and family asking if it was really him in the videos that were now everywhere online. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. The footage was clear, showing everything. His aggressive tone, his unnecessary search, his obvious shock when he realized who Harold really was. The next morning, Derek woke up to find news. Trucks parked outside his apartment building. Reporters were calling his name, shouting questions about racial profiling and police misconduct. He had to sneak out the back way just to avoid the cameras, but even then, someone managed to get a photo of him looking disheveled and defeated. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Other officers avoided making eye contact with Derek as he walked through the hallway. Some whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. Everyone knew that what had happened to Derek could happen to any of them. But nobody wanted to be associated with the officer who had become the face of everything wrong with policing in America. Chief Rodriguez called Derek into her office at 9 o'clock sharp. She was a tough woman who had worked her way up through the ranks over 20 years, and Derek had always respected her. But today, she looked at him like he was a stranger, like he was someone who had betrayed everything the badge was supposed to represent. "Sit down, Matthews," she said without looking up from her computer screen. "I've been watching the news all morning. I've been reading the reports. I've been fielding phone calls from reporters, politicians, and civil rights groups. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Derek opened his mouth to speak, but Chief Rodriguez held up her hand to stop him. "Let me tell you what you've done," she continued. "You've turned our entire department into a national embarrassment. You've given every critic of law enforcement exactly the ammunition they needed to prove their point about racial profiling. You've harassed a Supreme Court justice, Derek, one of the 9 most powerful people in our entire legal system." "Chief, I didn't know who he was," Derek said weakly. "That's exactly the problem." Chief Rodriguez slammed her hand on the desk. "It shouldn't matter who he was. You had no reason to stop that man in the first place, no reason to search him, no reason to treat him like a criminal. The only reason you pulled him over was because he was a black man driving through a white neighborhood, and we both know it." Derek wanted to deny it, wanted to come up with some other explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had profiled Harold based on nothing but his race and his modest car, and now the whole world could see it. "I'm placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately," Chief Rodriguez said. "Turn in your badge and your weapon. There will be a full investigation, and I suspect federal authorities will want to talk to you as well. This incident involves a Supreme Court justice, Derek. The FBI is already asking questions." As Derek walked out of the police station that morning carrying his personal belongings in a cardboard box, reporters swarmed him. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in his face, and voices shouted questions he couldn't answer. "Officer Matthews, do you have anything to say to Justice Washington? Was this incident motivated by racial bias? Should you be fired for what happened last night?" Derek pushed through the crowd without saying a word, but his silence only made things worse. By that afternoon, his photo was on every major news website, usually next to a picture of Justice Washington looking dignified and composed, despite what he had endured. The story had taken on a life of its own. Civil rights leaders were using it as an example of systemic racism in law enforcement. Politicians were calling for police reform. Social media was filled with people sharing their own stories of being profiled by police officers who made assumptions based on skin color rather than behavior. Derek's wife, Patricia, had to take time off work because reporters kept showing up at her office. His teenage son was getting harassed at school by classmates who had seen the videos. His elderly mother called him crying, asking how he could have treated that nice old man so badly. "I raised you better than this," she said, through her tears. "Your father would be ashamed if he were alive to see this." Meanwhile, Justice Washington was handling the media attention with the same grace and dignity he had shown during the traffic stop itself. In interviews, he didn't attack Derek personally or call for revenge. Instead, he talked about the need for better training, for officers to examine their own biases, for systemic changes in how police departments operate. "This incident," Justice Washington said during a press conference outside the Supreme Court building, "is not about me personally. It's about the thousands of citizens who face this kind of treatment every day without the protection that my position eventually provided. It's about the black teenagers who get stopped for walking through certain neighborhoods. It's about the families who teach their children how to survive encounters with police officers instead of how to trust them." Derek watched that press conference from his living room, still wearing his pajamas at 2 p.m, because he had nowhere to go and nothing to do. Justice Washington's words hit him harder than any angry accusation could have. The man he had humiliated was using his pain to try to make things better for everyone, while Derek was hiding in his apartment feeling sorry for himself. That evening, Derek's phone rang. It was a reporter from a major newspaper wanting to do an interview, wanting to hear his side of the story. Other calls followed: TV producers, magazine writers, even a publisher who thought Derek's story could make a good book about learning from mistakes. But Derek didn't want to profit from what he had done. He didn't want to become famous for being the racist cop who harassed a Supreme Court justice. He just wanted to disappear, to go back in time and make different choices, to be the kind of officer he had always thought he was. As he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Derek realized that his old life was over. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for had been destroyed in 20 minutes of bad judgment and deep-seated prejudice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences, and decisions that would determine whether he could ever find a way to make things right. 3 months after that fateful night on Riverside Drive, Derek sat in a small courtroom watching his life officially fall apart. The federal civil rights charges had been filed, just as everyone expected. The evidence was overwhelming. Hours of video footage showing him treating Justice Washington differently because of his race, with no legitimate reason for the stop in the first place. Derek's lawyer, a public defender who looked barely old enough to drive, shuffled through papers, nervously as the judge read the charges: violation of civil rights under color of law, deprivation of rights under federal statute. Words that meant Derek would likely spend time in federal prison and would never work in law enforcement again. But the legal consequences were just the beginning. Derek had lost his job, obviously. His marriage was hanging by a thread. Patricia had moved in with her sister and was talking about divorce. His son wouldn't speak to him, embarrassed to share the same last name as the officer who had become a symbol of everything wrong with American policing. Finding new work was impossible. Every potential employer Googled his name and found the same story, the same videos, the same headlines. Even jobs that had nothing to do with law enforcement wouldn't hire him. He was toxic, a liability that no company wanted to take on. Derek had burned through his savings trying to pay for a better lawyer, but it hadn't mattered. The case was too clear-cut, the evidence too damning. He was going to plead guilty and hope for mercy from a judge who had probably watched the same videos as everyone else in America. Meanwhile, Justice Washington had turned his painful experience into something powerful. 6 weeks after the incident, he testified before Congress about police reform, his quiet dignity commanding attention from senators who rarely agreed on anything. "What happened to me that night," Justice Washington told the packed hearing room, "happens to ordinary citizens every single day in this country. The only difference is that my position eventually protected me from worse consequences. But what about the young father who doesn't have a Supreme Court appointment? What about the college student who doesn't have a daughter who's a civil rights lawyer? They deserve the same respect, the same protection under law that every American citizen should expect. His testimony led to the Justice in Policing Act, a comprehensive reform bill that required bias training for all federal law enforcement officers and created new accountability measures for police departments across the country. It wasn't everything activists wanted, but it was progress, real change that came directly from that 20-minute encounter on a quiet street. Derek watched Justice Washington's congressional testimony from his apartment, still wearing the same clothes he'd slept in. The contrast was striking. Here was a man who had been wronged, using his pain to help others, while Derek wallowed in self-pity and resentment. But then something unexpected happened. 2 weeks before Derek's sentencing hearing, Justice Washington did something that shocked everyone, including Derek himself. He reached out. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 6 months after their first encounter. Derek almost didn't answer. He'd been getting hate calls and death threats for months. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Matthews," said a familiar voice, calm and measured. "This is Justice Washington. I wonder if we might talk." Derek's throat went dry. "Justice Washington, I don't understand. Why are you calling me?" "Because I've been thinking about you," Harold said simply. "About what happened that night and what's happened since. I'd like to meet with you if you're willing." They met at a small coffee shop across town, away from the media and the crowds. Derek arrived first, nervous and confused about why the man he'd humiliated would want to see him. When Justice Washington walked in, Derek was struck again by his quiet dignity, the way he carried himself with such grace despite everything he'd endured. "Thank you for coming," Justice Washington said as he sat down across from Derek. "I know this must be difficult for you." Derek stared at his coffee cup, unable to meet the older man's eyes. "I don't understand why you wanted to see me. I mean, after everything I did to you." "What you did was wrong," Justice Washington said directly. "But I don't believe you're an evil person, Mr. Matthews. I think you're someone who made a terrible mistake based on assumptions and prejudices that you'd never really examined." Derek looked up, surprised by the kindness in the justice's voice. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No, it doesn't," Justice Washington agreed. "But punishment alone doesn't create change. Real change comes from understanding, from people willing to do the hard work of examining their own hearts and minds." Justice Washington leaned forward slightly. "I have a proposition for you. After you serve your sentence, I'd like you to consider working with community organizations that focus on police-community relations. Share your story, help train other officers, use your experience to prevent what happened to me from happening to others." Derek was stunned. "You want me to help? After what I did to you?" "Especially because of what you did to me," Justice Washington replied. "You understand now, in a way you never did before, how prejudice can blind us to someone's humanity. That understanding, as painful as it is, could be valuable in helping others see what you couldn't see that night." Over the following months, as Derek served his 6-month federal sentence, he thought constantly about Justice Washington's words. The time in minimum security prison gave him space to reflect, to really examine the beliefs and assumptions that had led him to that moment on Riverside Drive. When Derek was released, Justice Washington was true to his word. He connected Derek with organizations working on police reform, groups that were initially skeptical about working with the officer who had become famous for all the wrong reasons. But slowly, Derek began to find his voice. He spoke at police training sessions, sharing his story with young officers who looked just like he had 5 years earlier. He talked about how easy it was to let prejudice disguise itself as police work, how assumptions could turn a routine evening into a national scandal. "I thought I was a good cop," Derek would tell these audiences. "I thought I was protecting people. But I was really just protecting my own prejudices, my own fear of people who looked different from me. And it cost me everything. My career, my family, my reputation. But more importantly, It cost Justice Washington his dignity that night, and it could have cost him much more. The work wasn't easy. Many people, understandably, didn't want to hear from Derek. Some called him a fraud, someone trying to profit from his own racism. But others listened, especially young officers who could see themselves in his story. Derek never got his old life back. His marriage didn't survive, and his relationship with his son remained strained. He worked part-time jobs to pay the bills and spent his evenings talking to community groups and police departments. But for the first time since that night on Riverside Drive, Derek felt like he was doing something meaningful with his life. He couldn't undo what he'd done to Justice Washington, but he could use his mistake to help others avoid making the same one. And Justice Washington, in his wisdom and grace, had shown Derek something profound, that even the worst mistakes could become opportunities for redemption, if someone was willing to do the hard work of change. Years later, when people asked Justice Washington why he had reached out to the officer who had humiliated him, his answer was always the same. Justice isn't just about punishment. True justice is about healing, about making things better than they were before. Sometimes that means extending grace to people who don't deserve it, because that's the only way real change happens.